You might not be clapping at the end of this, so here's your trigger warning. I am going to use some alternate political theory, and I'll be using some terms that, if you hold true to our political formula, which I imagine you do, which is why you're here, you might get shocked a little bit. So yeah, crypto as a revolutionary center of power. Men adapt machinery to needs almost unconsciously and before they can formulate a reason for it. I came across this passage when I was doing some research on this topic, and I kind of felt like it mapped to our space pretty well. And in this talk, I'm more concerned about this notion of formulating a reason for crypto, especially for those who ask the question, why blockchain? Show of hands here who saw Eric Voorhees' Why Are We Here talk. Cool. For those who haven't, I highly recommend you jump on YouTube or something like this and check it out. I think Eric did an amazingly impassioned embodiment of the spirit of our movement, and he did it with eloquent prose. He talks about the virtues of our movement. He talks about the humanities efforts that are behind our movements. He talks about the peaceful rebellion of our movement. And for me, what I thought he was doing was effectively propagating our political formula, a set of ideas that we've accumulated over the past 14 years, certainly that I've been in this space, that is based on libertarian, extropian, Austrian, and cypherpunk ideals. But having that said, it hasn't changed that much either. And while it still ignites me as much as it is today, these ideas, they shape the way that we think, and consequently, they shape the systems that we create. They are the basis of our legitimacy, and with that, they're our appeal to the people who we want to start using our systems. But we have to take care of this political formula, and we need to develop it further, because we're no longer on the fringes of society anymore. Our detractors are no longer ignoring us. They are still laughing at us, but now they're actively fighting against us. And to that end, I think crypto in general has been on a mission to realize an open, decentralized financial system, something I'm sure you've heard ad nauseum. Our technology is the Hayekian, sly, roundabout way of taking money out of the hands of government, and we believe that if we can fix money, we can fix the state. But I think that this vision is somewhat limited, and our political theory and our economic theory is starting to obfuscate what I think is actually happening. So Eric, in his talk, he starts to compare and contrast laws of men against laws of math and code. He asks, which is more scientifically sound? And then he asks, what is the better representation of order? And this term order is the most important term for me, because I believe that we are creating not just a decentralized financial system, but a new political system, a new social order. And I'm not talking about that so much today, somewhat indirectly, but I have talked about it in previous sessions. And with that, our political formula becomes even more important if we start to view this in terms of a political system that is more general, or as in a social order. And so I started to look at this political formula, and there were some discrepancies within it. And with these discrepancies, if we are successful in our mission, we do reach some form of fundamental societal transformation. If there are inconsistencies within our political formula, they'll manifest themselves in society in a similar way that we're seeing conflicts as a result of liberalism in our Western liberal democracies today. So this notion of, like, for example, this notion of disintermediation, of self-sovereignty, of trustlessness, on closer inspection, they don't really hold up in some ways. Now, with trustlessness, sure, if you are educated in code or maths, you can read Solidity or whatever the smart contract language or circuit design is. If you understand how the game theory, then you could make that argument. But for the average person on the street who is computer illiterate, then they basically fall back onto social heuristics, right? We might as well be using our technology, we might as well be high priests, essentially, right? We might as well be pulling Excalibur from the stone and saying that we have a basis of legitimacy. But this notion of self-sovereignty has been more problematic for me, mostly because the term sovereignty is something that is hard to kind of really nail down. And the closer you look at it, the less it makes sense. We could make an argument that we do enable self-sovereignty of the individual, but there's quite a lot of loaded terms in that. If we assume that the network is ambivalent to our transaction, that we are the only ones holding our private key, and we sign that transaction, then sure, like at that point, I would say that the individual is still securing that part of the network, their transaction, and like that is a self-sovereign action in some ways. But at the end of the day, that transaction has to be injected into the network and distributed throughout the network. And then this creates a very weird dependency that is not really of a self-sovereign type. It relies on a collective to build and maintain. And it requires that collective to be ambivalent to that transaction. So these ideas, they're actually more like rights. They're gifts to the individual who's participating in the network. And so this notion of collectivism versus individualism as a dichotomy also kind of starts to blur. And what I would like to make the argument for is actually we are subject individuals to an order, and that order is crypto. So where does sovereignty lie then? Well, we could make an argument that, a strong argument actually, for popular sovereignty, right? Consent of the governed, we the people, for the people, by the people, whatever, right? And we can do that because you can run a node, you can participate in the security of the order pretty easily. There's express consent because you have to always transact with the order from your side. And there's also cheap exit costs, so you can always leave the order pretty easily. So maybe that's where the claim we can do. And certainly we've created, probably in my view, if we view the system as a political system, it is by far the strongest claim to popular sovereignty that exists. But there's another issue with this, and this is in terms of crisis. Now, with orders, they have to be built and maintained, and as who does the building and maintaining in these orders? I post this not to disparage Ethereum in any way, but hard forks or forks in general are basically a normal function of any blockchain, and certainly Bitcoin is not immune to them either. But they start to expose an organized minority that is behind our order, one that's made up of coders, of researchers, ones that are made up of foundations, ones that are made up of miners or validators. And they have to, in points of crisis, whether it's a protocol upgrade or something more contentious, this organized minority reveals itself. And this kind of undoes the illusion of this consent of the governed. The reason why I post this one is because this personally impacted me the most. It was a change of the political formula in Ethereum. And I am sympathetic to Ethereum Classic for maintaining the social contract that was originally laid out, even though proof of stake was still part of that, but anyway, whatever. So trying to find like a definition of sovereignty, a lot don't make sense. But I came across Carl Schmitt's political theology. And within that, he says the following: the exception is more interesting than the rule. The rule proves nothing. The exception proves everything. In the exception, the power of real life breaks through the crust of a mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. Now, Carl Schmitt, he was a jurist, and he was very critical of legalistic perspectives of sovereignty. And that's what he means by this mechanism that has become torpid by repetition. But in our case, the mechanism is the part-time parliament, our public consensus, that is churning away, creating block after block of the order. And the hard fork is the crisis, is the exception. And this is where real life starts to break through. And it's the organized minority around this order who can change the order that is the real, true sovereigns. Now, this would be no surprise, everything I said, to the Italian elite theorists of the 18th century, such as Gaetano Mosca. He took a historical view of many societies and basically found that in all societies that he looked at least, there was two classes, the rulers and the ruled, right? Robert Michels would take this further and say that this concept applies to almost every social organization, whether it's large families, churches, nations, or empires. He would go on to coin the term the iron law of oligarchy. And he basically states there's three reasons for this, three factors. One is mass and scale. You physically cannot get all the people all in the same room. Even if you could, you need to narrow down the choices. Someone needs to narrow down the choices for voting in some manner. And worse, most people don't want to be in constant referenda. They don't want to be constantly making governance decisions. They have better things to do, and they lack the time and interest. But there's also technical and bureaucratic details, such as financial or administrative, any kind of things that are required to maintain an organization or any kind of form of leadership. Such as, in say voting, like you need to round up all of the people to get them to vote in some place or through some mechanism, whether it's technological or analog. And then there's a tactical reason as well. We like to think in democracies that our representatives are chosen by the people, but it's actually the inverse, right? It is the elites that choose themselves. They propagate and market themselves, and then we choose them through that mechanism. And this is why you get people like Trump and Biden apparently supposed to be the pinnacle of the free world, which I don't believe at all. So the point being is that there is without leadership, without a plan, there is no organization. The elite theorists will also go to say that revolutions do not happen without some kind of elite backing or patronage. And if they do happen, then it's usually just a mass sort of emotional outcry. And we've kind of seen that with how Occupy Wall Street kind of panned out and didn't actually have any goal and affect any real change. The elite theorists basically create two subgroups out of these elites. One are the governing elites or the politicians. Our analog would be researchers, coders, or large stakeholders in networks. And the non-governing elites, which are the bureaucratic or the managerial class. This would be miners or validators or the foundations that crop up around various projects. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, so out of our little microcosm, and we think about political systems and rebellions, I guess. Maurice, I'm not going to even try and pronounce his last name. Okay, I am apparently. Finocchiaro. There we go. Right. He goes on to say, there's an opportunity that presents itself through this line of thinking, which is why I don't discard it. And he goes on to say that as soon as there is a shift in the balance of political forces, then the manner in which the ruling class is constituted changes also. If a new source of wealth develops in a society, if a practical importance of knowledge grows, if an old religion declines or a new one is born, if a new current of ideas spreads, then simultaneously far-reaching dislocations occur in the ruling class, right? This applies to crypto. We are the new source of wealth. We are the new religion. We are the new set of ideas. And it's this source of wealth, which I'll talk about a little bit further in this talk, which is the key thing here. We have managed to attract an enormous amount of capital compared to any other movement, right? At its peak, we've managed to collectively capture $3 trillion worth of value. Today, okay, it's in a bear market, but we're still $1 trillion. That's incredible. And this is our bargain. If the ruling classes fail to adapt their formula, then they'll either be replaced or they can renew themselves. They can adopt the political formula. And it's our role as counter-elites to propagate our legitimate political formula. Now, the elite theorists don't really talk about, they talk about the structure and they have some good ideas and some not so good ideas that I don't fully subscribe to, but they don't really talk about how this happens. And for that, we can turn to Bertrand de Jouvenel. He has a trilogy on his political theory, and the second book is called On Power. And within that book, he develops this model that tries to explain this process. And again, it's embedded in like a lot of historical examples. So when we look at a government, we tend to think of it as a singleton, right? Like it's just like one monolith. But the reality is, at least in Jouvenel's view, is that it's actually made up of multiple centers of power, and they're all in tension and conflict. So Jouvenel views power in almost like an abstract sense, similar to like how Heidegger or Jacques Ellul or Ted Kaczynski views the technological process. That it is something like an egregore or an abstraction that just, once institutionalized, starts just doing its thing regardless of humans. And for him, once the center of power starts to begin, due to physical or efficiency reasons, it starts to having to delegate power to these subsidiaries. And so very much like the elite theorists, you start to see the similar thing where you have like the governing elite and non-governing elites, right? We'll use the terminology center and subsidiary for that, right? Now, because once this power has been delegated from the center to the subsidiary, they also become another center of power, right? And both of these centers of power seek to expand and consolidate their power, which is why this tension and conflict arises. Now, if the center starts to expand their power, the subsidiaries try to resist that because it will mean that their power is somewhat undermined. Yet, if the subsidiary tries to expand their power, then the center gets quite alarmed by that and so tries to undermine them. And how they both try to undermine each other is by making appeals to the periphery. Now, when the center is successful in making an appeal to the periphery, it creates a dependency on the periphery to the center. And when that happens, the center power expands, it consolidates its power, and yeah. Now, the other part of this I should mention is like, this is stripped of like, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? And that brings us into Jouvenel's recognition of power being somewhat dualistic in nature. Jouvenel basically views this power egregore, this construct, to be both simultaneously caring of the people that it looks after because it supports and maintains it, but also at the same time develops its own almost predatory-like nature where it starts exploiting any resources that are available to it. At the same time, Jouvenel also points out that power tends to have a shrouding or camouflage essence to it. Every time it starts making these appeals to the periphery, it will create some kind of construct like democracy, for example, or in our case, even decentralization, right? And this basically starts to make where the center of power is, where the authority lies, more convoluted. It's harder to pin down. Now, he goes through a bunch of examples in the book, but a great example, I think at least, is in the sort of high Middle Ages with the rise of the Germanic kingdoms, right? So at the beginning of the high Middle Ages, you had Philip Augustus II, and as a monarch, he was typical of the time. Let's give him some credit. But the reality is he had no taxation, he had no standing army, he had no government officials or government apparatus, really, and he had comparatively little wealth, right, beyond his own estate. Contrast that, or fast forward 400 years, and you have Louis XIV, and he had widespread taxation, right? He had a standing army of 200,000 men. He had a royal court. He had a police force. He had a government apparatus. And he had a royal treasury. It's pretty dope. Now, for him, that is, right? Now, during this time period, Jouvenel points out that there were basically these tools for powers, expansion, and consolidation. It was taxation, coinage, military reform and patronage, and rule of law. And these are the main changes through this period. So, these slides are weird. Okay, so for Jouvenel, he views coinage as not being, or money as not being a very natural process. He believes that it requires an organized minority to basically get the supply of metal, so doing the mining and the minting, like the actual coinage, as well as developing out an organized market, as well as the initial demand for that coinage, right? Now, why power as an abstract concept cares about this, right? Well, the two main reasons is because it allows for disintermediated relationships between people, between anyone who's doing any kind of commerce, yet it is still fundamentally dependent on that authority, right? If you're using that coin, or you're using cash or whatever, yeah, you might be transacting with somebody else, but the reality is you're using Bitcoin or ETH or, whatever, Czech crowns, And so there's a dependency there. And this means that the authority itself is efficiently spreading and making itself shrouded. The other part of expansion here is this notion of transfer of wealth over long distances. With coinage, you could now take more value further with less weight. And of course, with crypto, we can transact to anywhere humanity is that has an internet connection. But this also undermined feudal lords. Feudal Jews were no longer paid in kind or with like services. They now moved into a form of taxation where they were dependent on the coinage, which meant that these feudal lords would then end up putting this coinage onto their subjects. And once this was established, they would have taxation revenues, which then allowed the king to do patronage of mercenaries as well as legal administration. Now, when that happens, you now create people that are loyal to the king, right? Rather than having the king have to go to the subsidiary and get their allegiance and their men that way. And so now you get this undermining of these feudal lords. And once you have this coinage system in place, you can start to build more sophisticated institutions on top of. And at least in this kind of system, it doesn't really apply to crypto, but anyone who ends up owning a mint, it kind of applies to crypto, but we're better at it. Actually, no, I just had a thought. So monetary debasement basically like weakens the subsidiaries as well, right? Like if you can take the wealth of the coins, spend it or whatever, and then debase the currency later, then anything that follows after you will have less money and they'll be less powerful. And this actually, like I just realized, this kind of applies to crypto because you would imagine that it works differently because whoever is like becomes the stakeholders in like the beginning of the network's birth, and as the network grows in size and more value is encoded into the token, then that percentage of value is held more with the original creators or the original participants in that network, right? And so they're always going to be comparatively stronger in terms of their purchasing power than anybody else that follows in the network. Yeah, right. Yeah, and so the other one was rule of law. And there's this Latin phrase, authority, not truth, makes law. And written law kind of behaves in a similar way, right? So written law enables widespread transmission of monarch decisions. This notion of equality under the law also undermines subsidiaries, right? So when everyone becomes equal, sure, that's great, but at the end of the day, everyone's equal, except for the authority that they all appeal to, right? And so again, this dependency is then created. This also undermines feudal laws, local courts, and decisions as well. And then once they have this, as you're making legal determinations, you have another source of revenue. And all of this, basically, as I mentioned, the equality thing creates a dependence on the authority. We can see this with the reign of King Henry II, which his reforms, legal reforms, actually laid down the foundations for common law, and that has now spread throughout at least the Anglo world. And you can see this with King Stephen. As a king or a monarch, he was comparatively spiteful and incompetent. And through his rule, there was basically this period of time called the anarchy, and it led to a lot of social unrest, a lot of political fragmentation. There was a breakdown of law and order, and subsequently the church came in to fill in those gaps, as well as the barons. And the barons were pretty funny because they ended up building a whole bunch of unlicensed castles, and they became tyrants. They started ruling their local populations with an iron fist, right? After King Stephen was deposed, it was King Henry II's turn, and he wanted to go back to a form of law and order like King Henry I, and that was a return to this lion of justice. So his first actions were basically to consolidate the royal jurisdiction over the local courts and over the church. And it was kind of funny, right? Because it was a traveling circus. It was decentralized in a way, right? Like it was literally him running around with his merry men to all of these different villages and having the royal court come with him, right? And it would take some time before his decisions, and every time he was doing that, he was undermining the feudal lords, and he was making reforms of civil, criminal, and ecclesiastical law. Sorry, I've only read these things. Thank you. Yeah. And so eventually, this court did settle down in Westminster. And there was a lot of opposition to it as well, particularly with the church, and this led to the murder of the Archbishop at the time, Thomas Becket. So again, we see the center of power and this periphery in this sort of Jouvenelian conflict, right? And as a result, this royal court started to create written law and transmitting it, undermining these lords. But more interestingly was that King Henry II expanded these legal writs to free men. Now, free men weren't subject to anybody, right? They weren't subject to a local lord or whatever. They were just free men. And this is where we get to Jouvenel's notion of liberty, right? He basically identifies two forms of liberty. One is economic liberty, which is this sort of self-asserted liberty. You're living off the grid or whatever. You're basically self-reliant. And I think this is kind of what we imagine when we think about the self-sovereign individual in some ways, right? But then there's an inferior form of liberty, and this is political liberty, right? This is granted to those who do not have economic liberty. And again, it's basically dependent has a dependency of the periphery onto the center, right? This is rights. This is the beginning of rights. And so therefore we see this state-created subject individual. So from here, we start to see that Jouvenel starts to view this process or this Jouvenelian conflict being an engine or a mechanism for bringing certain ideas up, into the public consciousness. And we can start, this idea of this liberty or this individual kind of starts with King Charles I. Now, him as a center of power, he basically started to expand his power and consolidate it too quickly, right? And so then he was charged, it was a very novel thing to do, is to actually undermine the king's authority and charge him at this point, right? And he was charged as being a tyrant, overthrowing the rights and liberties of the people, right? The problem is the people were the parliamentarians who were acting on the behalf of people, but it was the parliamentarians that were putting themselves into power, essentially, right? And this is the first time that we challenge the divine right of kings. This continued to develop under King James II in the beginning of the Enlightenment. He did basically the same thing. He tried to expand and consolidate his power too quickly. He was developing a standing army. They said, no, 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 no. But he was a Catholic or a converted Catholic, and he started stacking government positions with Catholics. And the Protestant parliamentarians did not like that. And you had Hobbes and Locke at this time developing this notion of the individual, right? And this basically gave a form of a political formula, a form of legitimacy to this idea that had already started with the parliamentarians, right? Which led to the 1688 Glorious Revolution, which led to the deposition of King James II. It was quite peaceful. I don't think there was a beheading. But this was basically the secularization of Western society and the end of divine right of kings, right? And then the following year, we had the Bill of Rights, and we had parliamentary power, parliamentary sovereignty, and personal liberties. This continues, this Jouvenelian conflict, can also be seen with the United States seeking independence from the royal crown. And here in the Declaration of Independence, we see this passage: "We hold the truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that are, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," right? So at least these are based in natural rights, but this notion of equality and this notion of rights is implying that there is an authority and a dependency on the people who subscribe to these ideas. Now, this idea continues to develop post-World War II, with the drafts of the Universal Human Rights by the United Nations. Now, here it's kind of interesting because at least here, this was based in natural law. Here, there's not really a basis. The closest political theology you get is this notion of this sort of crusade to the cause of peace, I guess, is what they call it. But this second paragraph is interesting, right? So it's like, among the engaged in the promotion of human rights, there is a general agreement that the rights are an aspect of humanity, that they are not dependent on such characteristics as race, nationality, gender, nor do they depend on a person's presence within a territory of a particular political entity, right? It's like, okay, that sounds good, maybe. But then they go on to say that the rights are an ethical norms with a legal content that requires that they should be honored and enforced by public institutions. Now it's like, okay, well, you have this idea of ethical norms, but they're supposed to be they're not tied to anything that makes you human in some way, right? And so then it's like, well, who is what authority or who is actually making up these ethical norms and assigning these this legal content to it? The people who wrote this, right? That's where. Now, there's another aspect of human rights, which is, you might have seen this stuff before, but this is more under-recognized, right? And this graph is not part of what happened, what the fuck happened in 1971, but I would love someone to add it, because this was basically the time when the United States started to use human rights as its part of its foreign policy, right? As leaders of the free world, blah, blah, blah. And it was quite interesting because at this time, there were a bunch of, there was a bunch of dictators. You had the Soviet Union, you had dictators in Latin America. And then these transnational elites starts using the corporations to start funding these human rights organizations in these countries, right? And a few short years in all of these countries, you start to, they basically start collapsing in some way, shape, or form, right? Now, again, I'm not trying, it's important to realize, it's not, you don't want to imply or impose a moral judgment on this, right? I'm just trying to point out that there's this Jouvenian conflict or process that's happening. And here you start to see that power becomes global, and it's the nation states that now become subsidiaries. And so the thing that I haven't looked into too much, but I would like to, is what is the nature of this power on the world stage, right? We have this United Nations, but if you look at why these transnational policy groups arise, which are the World Economic Forum and the Bilderberg Group and these sort of things, is because the UN is considered to be too impotent. It's full of rules and procedures, which are, by design to have good governance. But they're also exclusionary, right? They basically only talk, have states recognize states and talk amongst states. And so these policy networks arise because not only does it allow to have world leaders from these states, but it also allows the inclusion of corporations. And it's quite interesting because they act very, it's kind of this very soft power of discretionary global governance, where they rely on basically three modes of operation. One is selection, the other is status, and then there's secrecy. And so this soft power, or basically, first it achieves status by inviting the right kinds of various world leaders or people who want to be part of global governance. But then for certain topics, it does its selection very intentionally. So it finds the right people to talk about a very specific topic. And then it provides this secrecy or this room of discretion, which allows them to allow these various people participating in global governance to discuss matters without having to deal with any kind of pressure. So what am I trying to say with all of this, right? I think crypto is a rising center of power, and that we are a counter-elite, even though we don't see ourselves as such. We've created a robust order with a parliament, there's public consensus, and the robustness is our ability to maintain these protocols even when they are under attack. And they are resistant to overthrow. They are transnational by design. I didn't talk about the, actually I completely skipped it, whoops. So both on, with expansionary tools and coinage, you can actually start to see this, well, you can see this in two forms within crypto. One is with central bank digital currencies, so, and banks, right? You can start to see the central bank undermine the bank's subsidiary, like banks as subsidiaries by putting everything onto their balance sheet, right? But you can also see this in the transition from proof of work to proof of stake, where the center power creates a better form of money, essentially, or security of the network. This undermines this, the miners in basically, but it's more efficient. It allows it to expand more. Like technically, you could secure something like Ethereum from your phone, or you can participate in the staking pool pretty easily. So we've created better expansionary tools, certainly in the form of money, and certainly in the form of law. By law here, I'm talking about smart contracts, right? But not only that, we can allow for autocentric law for individuals to create contracts and agreements between each other where they think that they are talking with only each other, but they're effectively dependent on the authority. And taxation, which is basically transaction fees in our networks. The demand's already built in. We have strong juridical defense and enforcement through how these networks, basically you do a transaction and the network comes to agreement on what the current state is. We have a competitive political formula, but it does need some work. We have very strong social mobility into elite circles. If you are able to code or if you can run a node, you can participate in any way you want. And we have a strong case for popular sovereignty in terms of legitimacy, both because it is stronger in terms of this notion of consent of the governed. It's stronger because of explicit consent. You have to transact with the network. It's non-coercive, which is amazing, at least for now. And there's cheap exit costs, and we offer this. It's still subject individual, right? Like it's still this inferior form of liberty, but it's much stronger in terms of its, in terms of getting close to this notion of economic liberty without actually being economic, like real economic liberty. And so I think crypto will become like a political system that will challenge nation states, certainly. And it may become a model for world order. Anyway, that's it from me. Thank you.
So I've seen this talk now in various forms develop over the last year and a half, I guess, and also at the beginning of this week. I mean, it's really, it's getting refined, and the historical contexts are well chosen, and the messaging is incredibly well grounded and well reasoned. Jared, I'm pretty blown away.
Thank you.
I really don't have a question on that level, but I would like to have a little bit more, I think, meat at the end about how it is that we move forward with this. You have a solid basis of this is how things work, and are not really taking a prescriptive leap forward. And so I'm curious, is that intentional?
Yes, it is actually. Like, I mean, for me, like, I tried to say this in the talk, right? Like, I feel like the political formula hasn't really changed in the past 14 years that I've been in this space. And look, I've been disillusioned, okay, for the past two or 3 years, right? Like, the way crypto has gone, like, has been very, I don't know how to say it, market orientated in some ways, right? Where it's kind of, focused on, there's nothing wrong with venture capital per se, but, there's this attempt to try and get like, adoption and enter the marketplace. There's a pressure for that and find like this sort of utility. And that's all good, that's fine, that's great. It actually expands crypto, right? But it's come at the cost of like, forgetting like what we're talking about, right? And that's why I liked Eric's talk as well, and why I recommend you watch it, is because it it reminds you and it inspires you, like, why we're here in this room. And for me, I would just want to start a dialogue about this sort of stuff. Like, I don't have all the answers. For all I know, I've just been making up a bunch of stuff. But like, if we can get into a dialogue and we can start developing these ideas and taking it further than like the extropians and the cypherpunks, the previous generation cyberpunks, and develop them in a serious way, and then present that to the world as a strong basis for legitimacy of this system, then I think that crypto as a movement will be much more successful. But that also requires us starting to think of ourselves as elites. And like historically, we don't have
any problem thinking about ourselves as about 1337s, not at all.
Right, okay, okay, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's my answer to that.
So the only discrepancy that I can pick out of it is, on one hand, you say, at one time we had 3 trillion in capital to promote what it is that we're doing. Now we have 1 trillion. There is a natural tension there in this self-financing capital, which you and I think many people have a problem with, the financialization.
Yeah, I mean.
So how do we move, outside of that, but yet still take advantage of the capital which we've captured and the power?
I don't think it's mutually exclusive, right? Like, I think the fact that we as a political movement are able to attract any capital, most political movements don't, right? And so like, we solved for that new source of wealth thing, right? It's just a matter of like developing these both in parallel, basically. I don't think that, and as long as we build the systems in the way that adhere to the political formula that we currently have, we already view those projects as being more legitimate in this space. And when they do not subscribe to that political formula, we're like, oh, that's not really crypto. And so we just need to keep developing that sort of stuff and attracting capital into it, which, if anyone who has capital, it'll naturally flow there, because it is one of the best places you can put capital where you're not going to get rugged by your bank, which has happened to me a few times already. So, and I'm sure many of you.
So there's also, I mean, you're speaking after Rose, and Rose had a slide there where she listed current projects, yeah, and Logos is listed there, and you guys.
Thank you.
Okay.
I love DarkFi, by the way.
Yeah. You guys are talking a lot.
Yeah.
And did you listen to Rose's talk, or have you?
I've seen many of her talks. I didn't see this one. I'm not sure if it's in similar vein or a new one. But
oh, she's super as intellectual as you, with all kinds. Yeah,
I'll have
definitely have to watch it afterwards. But with the familiarity of lunar punk and the basic concepts and the counterpoint to solar punk, which came out of the Ethereum.
I don't think it's a counterpoint per se, right? It's a development. It's in addition to solar punk.
Okay,
I think
you can check me on that one.
I'm right.
I just wanted to lay out the fact that you're basically conversant in the narrative. What's the difference between the way that lunar punk is approaching their narrative and the memetics of the network state and the way that Logos is approaching it? Because if I recall correctly, you're a pretty solid critic of Balage's network state approach as well.
There's 2 questions there. So I guess the second part of that, I think it's commendable that Balaji's trying to define what a network state is, but then I've tried to define what a state is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but there's a great quote from a UN general who'd been working in international law for 50 years, and he even said that I'm 100% convinced that I'll die before anyone can tell me what a state is, right? And so, it's commendable that Balaji wants to define what a network state is, but then you don't need territory, you don't need a leader per se, and there was a third point to his definition. international recognition. Like that's kind of applying this new concept to like old world ideas, and I think there's some those would be nice to have, but not fundamental to definition. In terms of memetics, like I love lunar punk. I think it's fantastic what Rose and the Dark5 people are trying to develop.
Because Logos has its own stark visual language, and is also approaching a mimetic language with acid. So acid.info is where you can find out more information also about how Logos is communicating, but you're also entering into this territory.
Yeah, no, definitely. For us, it's much more early, right? Like, I don't think we have proper meme warfare tactics down in any sense, right?
But you do intend to get into meme.
Oh, absolutely. I think
and provocation,
I think memetics is like a fantastic vehicle for like getting people to get ideas, right? Like quickly. And for me, there's I don't go on 4chan that much anymore, but like in my youth, I used to spend more time on 4chan, for example.
In your youth, yeah,
okay, yeah. Old guys, you know. But like, what was great about those memes, right, is like they would make you laugh, but they would also make you think in some ways, right, or expose you to new ideas. And like, I don't know much about Zoomers, but like I imagine like that, like TikTok and blub, 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 shorts and things, like that's kind of a way that they get this information. I saw this amazing one that was, what was it? Do you remember it? It was that cat thing, and it was the history of that lake, right? That was, yeah. But it was, I forget what it was, but it was amazing. It was just, I learned so much in 30 seconds, and it entertained me the entire time. So like,
well, yeah, so I'm kind of like a big fan of what you're doing. So I'd kind of like to bring a self-referential point that comes back to the memetics. One of the people that recently joined Logos came up to me at the beginning of the week and said, "Hey, Michael, I'm working with Logos, and I heard you're a cool dude, and like we should have a beer with each other." And I was like, "Okay, yeah, great." And then the next day, he was sitting at Big Smoker, and I sat down next to him, and he goes, "Are you Exiled Surfer?" And I'm like, yeah. He goes, "We work together." And I was like really surprised. I was like, "Where?" And he said to me, "WikiLeaks Central," at the time where I was primarily doing memetics about WikiLeaks and Anonymous and Occupy Wall Street and all this stuff. And it was a really amazing thing to with the whole curve of this last 15 years, which have been incredibly momentous in a lot of ways, to find somebody who's familiar with this whole. That was a big part of that time. That grew out of 4chan and WikiLeaks and Occupy Wall Street were literally, and Anonymous were all memes that we, as Rose mentioned, that we just perpetuated into existence. Yeah. And so I think that this is something that our culture does incredibly well. And now I'd kind of like to open up the audience to any questions rather than to monopolize this.
And just to add on to that, I think both with the Snowden revelations and WikiLeaks, both of those were reformist approaches, right? At that time, there was this idea that we could, reform our current political systems, and now I think it's a bit more in the Periopolis, the parallel society. How can we then create competitive institutions or competitive societies or competitive orders?
Or have multiple residencies, both in the existing states. They're not going to be going away very quickly, I don't think. And then having multiple residencies in Liberland, in Logos, it is an opt-in sort of approach. Please help me out here. Okay,
Yeah.
here we have the first one.
Good evening, Jared. So I noticed that you criticize the WF a lot. You use Google Docs. You acknowledge the United Nations and its policies. Like, what do you think of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? And like sub question, how do you see the overlap between the similar projects of DarkFi and Logos? Like, it seems like you're more of a funding development stage, and they're more of a testing stage.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think for the UN SDGs, I really like Bjorn Lomborg's book, Prioritizing Development. Because when you have 200 plus goals, you have no goals, right? And so what Bjorn Lomborg did was get a whole bunch of the top world economists together and then try to make dollar comparisons between all of these goals, and then try to find out of those goals, which is the most impactful. And so I'm not opposed to efforts that try to better human society at all, right? I think that's a great way, but I think when there's limited capital and there's limited human resources, and you have a massive coordination issue with trying to get sovereign nations to coordinate, then you really need to choose your goals effectively. And so yeah, I would recommend reading Prioritizing Development. There's some good stuff in there, especially about illicit financial flows, because even though they recognize that doing, they don't say KYC and ML, but basically KYC and ML, exposing illicit financial flows would actually be in their comparison, comparatively a very good use of money and high return. There's a lot of counter essays against illicit financial flows because it's largely to do with the corrupt politicians and corrupt financial elite, right? So then why are we applying this to everybody, average people? So yeah, and then DarkFi is that whole team is just phenomenal, right? They're very dedicated and they've been working on that. For Logos, so I started in Ethereum, porting Ethereum to Android and working on a mobile client, but it was supposed to be very politically, ideologically sound, that you would have disintermediated access to the crypto networks. It literally has a whole Geth client in it, so you can connect to the node that way, to the network that way. But the community went off in a different direction, and also, the Ethereum in 2014 had a different vision of what Ethereum was, right? It wasn't just the blockchain. There was two other sub-protocols. One was Whisper, which was peer-to-peer messaging, and one was Swarm, which was decentralized file storage. They abandoned Whisper, and we took over it, and that's now called Waku. And Swarm is still going along. I love that project philosophically, but there was a time there where the point being is that in building Status, we were relying on this platform promise, and we found ourselves over time finding ourselves moving further into protocol design and infrastructure, and now we do Nimbus, which is our own Ethereum 2 client, and we're building an execution client to go along with it. We've done hardware wallets. We're working on a light client protocol. We're working on Waku, and at some point that I realized this didn't make any sense to use the capital that we've raised for Status on this stuff. So I started self-funding with my co-founder Carl these separate projects, right? These infrastructure projects. And so Logos is effectively a decentralized technology stack that's made of three protocols that are actually separate projects. So Waku, I've already talked about, peer-to-peer private messaging. Codex, which is our decentralized file storage. It'll be compatible with IPFS, but the incentivization mechanism will work on consumer devices, and we also try to solve the censorship issue that exists within the parent, within IPFS and Filecoin. So we're trying to lower the barrier of entry while also making it more censorship resistant, and then we'll make it require encryption by default. And then Nomos, which is the privacy-focused multi-chain network that we're building out at the moment. These are all in different phases of development. So like Wacko's in production, version 2 is now being tested and will be in production. It's being used by our other clients like Railgun already. It underpins XMTP, and our Wallet Connect uses a form of it. Codex, I'm told there'll be, it's software development, right? But they're saying that there's going to be like an MVP by the end of the year. But I mean, let's give them until Q2 of next year. And then Nomos is the youngest of the projects, and so there's a lot of open research questions there. But if you're interested in helping contribute to that project, I'm working on some really cool privacy problems. Yeah, please reach out to me. So
is the goal of the tech stack, which Logos is building, to enable a new United Nations to come back to that?
In a way, right? So it's I think, so we have this concept of execution zones, and we believe that communities should start off as smart contracts, but ultimately turn into their own chains, and then if they get enough value, they can effectively secede, right, from the network. So it's very much like bringing these ideas of bridging and I don't like the term layer 2, but those sort of concepts and unifying them with all in one protocol. And then you can run your own consensus in these other things. So, but the idea is really to kind of create the infrastructure for anyone who wants to create these virtual states or temporary autonomous zones or network states. Yeah.
So in 2017, 2018, when you and I were first starting to think about moving, how it is that status could move towards DAOs, and we were discussing what even is a DAO, and we're still having this question. One of the things that that stuck with me most for the longest period of time, and I've quoted to people very often, because it's a very contentious issue at the moment, is that a DAO is the sum total of all of the individual contract interactions that individuals enter into with each other. And so I'm curious if, so forget all fuck the organization shit, fuck the nations, so to say, okay, we don't need international recognition, we don't need territory.
Right.
Is there any element of that concept then also in Logos, right? Because you're building a tech stack.
Well, I think, so for me, you don't really get away from territory. It's just that territory now exists in cyberspace, and that's kind of the jurisdiction of the chain, what happens on chain and what happens off chain, right? And so with Logos, in one of my other talks, I talk about, I think it was in 2017, the US Department of Defense and the United Nations recognized cyberspace as a fifth domain of conflict next to land, sea, air, and space, right? And then they go so far as to define what that is, and there's three components to it. One is the netizen or the individual. The other is the code or the logic that's running, and then the other is the infrastructure, right? The hardware and how the connectivity works, right? And so they recognize national sovereignty over cyberspace, or their partition of cyberspace. Now, if you can create a technology, and I believe you can, that obfuscates the participant, right? That has network level privacy, something like NIM or Tor or some kind of mixed net or even Wacko. And then you blind the network to the content of the transaction. So maybe a ZK VM that supports private data or public data or some new form of MPC. Then you can actually start challenging the national sovereignty while still running over their infrastructure and obfuscating the netizens within their jurisdiction that are participating in that. And I find that really fascinating. At least conceptually, it's an experiment that has to be done, and then there's probably going to be some naughty boy slaps for doing so if it works, right? But like that as an idea is really compelling. And I think if you do that, then you create this territory in cyberspace that acts as an autonomous region. Yeah.
So where is the pressure point with the implementation of ZK tech, right? I mean, if we could just hide basically everything, you know, where is the pressure point that existing power structures can, you know?
I mean, it's the people, right? Like, I mean, it's the physical presence in some way, right? So it's either the hardware infrastructure or it's the people. You know, that's why they're going after like Ross Ulbricht. That's why they go after you know, the Tornado Cash guys and so on, right? So
so there's still a rubber hose element.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Until definitely, and then I guess like the other part of I think territory in the physical space becomes liquid, right? So it's like people are participating in a coordination or a network state or whatever we're calling them. They're going to come to a physical, you know, it's the Zalu. If you come to a physical place, that becomes this sort of liquid territory made of these human social connections that are.
Well, we have the example of Liberland.
Doing it right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we have the example of Liberland, who just now has, you know, state power in attempting to crush it in a actually piece of strip where they have no jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Do we have another question?
Just a very simple question, which is that I'm just curious, like, what's the boundary between a protocol that could be thought of as a power and a protocol that's kind of impersonal enough that it cannot be thought of? So I feel like, for example, with Ethereum, it's more obvious that we are kind of part of a sort of, there is some authority that we're appealing to that's maintaining the governance. On the other hand, with a protocol like, you know, I don't know, HTTP or the English language, it seems much more impersonal and governance free. Maybe Bitcoin is somewhere.
I mean, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Thank you. I think I'd have to think about it, but like my initial response would be that Jouvenel views power in the very abstract sense, and it's not really tied to governance, right? If you think about TCP/IP or HTTP, it's literally all over the planet, right? Like the web is made up of it, right? And so this as a power structure is basically, or a power process is already kind of dominated. And in some ways, English is like that. Like we're in Czech Republic right now and we're speaking English. That's an interesting question. I guess I haven't really considered. I've only been considering it within the context of blockchains. But yeah, I have to think about it.
Hi, Jared. Thanks very much. Very engaging talk.
Oh, thank you.
We have all these options now, or definitions, I guess. You have the network state, we have Logos, you've just mentioned Liberland and Zuzalu. But what do you think, you know, so these are, I guess, like ideas and you know, proposed definitions, but what do you think would be like the major catalyst to push people to move away from the current world order and get people to stay in these newly defined areas? Do you think it'll be like a core belief system, or you know, what do you think that nucleus will look like in your opinion?
Yeah, great question. I think that it will require, at least under this mode of thought, and I'm not saying it's true, but like under a Jouvenelian conflict, there would have to be some kind of conflict, right, between a subsidiary power and the center power. And in what I've been describing, the subsidiary power would be crypto as a movement. And the concepts that we develop in that conflict will arise and either become part of the center power and transform it in some way, and we'll be squashed out, or which is kind of the CBDC direction, or we will end up replacing them in some shape or form. Now, but I think there's I don't know, I mean, when you go on the net, like, and there's a recommendation algorithm, so like you're in a bubble or whatever, but it feels like the US has kind of undermined the political neutrality of the US dollar by sanctioning countries left, right, and center, which is leading to BRICS, or like roughly 60% of the world's GDP, moving away from US swap lines. At least that's the intention. And so like they've undermined their own authority in some ways. And I feel that it's kind of, I don't know, like, I get the sense there's a lot more thrashing, and there's like the power is becoming harder and trying to clamp down on things. So maybe I think through this mismanagement, and like maybe there's an economic, maybe not an economic collapse, but maybe, or some ideas are propagated throughout social media or whatever that makes us realize like the nature of like our governments and like how they're performing might change. But ultimately it comes down, for crypto to be successful within its own political formula, or require us to develop and propagate the political formula and find what is appealing to the periphery or to the people to switch. But like, having that said, like I've been working on privacy technologies, and people don't care about privacy. They like the average person doesn't care about privacy. They care about convenience until it's too late, right? Until there's a black swan event, right? So I don't think it's not a very good answer, but that's all I've got.
So you mentioned targeting of individuals initially. I suppose there's this, whatever power that be, you can only do that for so long. You can't really target the masses before you get slapped back in the face. So do you think it's perhaps the attempted squashing out that could be a catalyst for this persistent change and longevity of a future network state, for lack of a better term?
So I want to throw one answer into this. Vinay Gupta, who was the launch manager for Ethereum, and also the designer of the Hexayurt, which is the aluminum tents that you see at Burning Man, that was originally designed for climate refugees a long time ago, wrote a paper for the cyber college for England. And what he talks about in this paper, and I will definitely post this link on my Twitter account for anybody that wants to read it, is he talks about the diminishing cost of enforcement. Is that so the diminishing returns on coercive lawmaking. So you can say that homosexuality is illegal, but there's a diminishing return on actually being able to enforce that. If you actually go out actively and start hanging people who are having homosexual sex, at some point there's diminishing returns that, of enforcing that. And so I think that what he's trying to say with this paper, and this is what he advised the government about, is at some point, you like turn the screws down far enough, and people are gonna, rise up and not accept it. Yeah, there is a tipping point for that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like I'm, very sympathetic towards Assange extradition case. Like, he's lost his appeal, and like they're trying to get like other judges to look at it, but like.
They've already done the damage.
Yeah, they've
really.
Yeah, exactly.
The process is the punishment.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But like, if there's apathy towards Assange, being extradited to the U.S. and there is no real backlash to that, then I feel like there's a lot of like passivity or compliance in the people. And I guess like the response to COVID also kind of like highlighted that, right? Like they are there's very good systems in place for making these appeals to the periphery and actually like manufacturing consent in some ways, right? And so that makes me a little bit pessimistic, I guess. But I don't know. Like, maybe there could be something that gets people riled up, like it happens. I'm sure there'll be some black swan event that does it.
Okay, so yeah, that's a little bit closer to what do you expect to have happen. So
Yeah.
essentially some unforeseen social, just like in V for Vendetta, where the kid gets shot, and then that was the thing. So I think one more question, and then I think we should wrap it up.
A lot of it was already kind of answered. I was gonna say that basically I got into crypto same time as you, I guess, Exiled Surfer. And my whole point was always that it was a challenge to the center. So I kind of saw this in a different way. And I was just thinking about basically that we really, to succeed, we need to appeal to the periphery. And how do we do that successfully if privacy doesn't work, which it doesn't. But I guess conflict is part of the answer, something that triggers it. But I was thinking also where do we anchor this? I guess it's the whole concept of sovereignty as well. If we're going to use the same as the center's already using as economic freedoms, for example,
Yeah, I mean, like,
successful.
I think in the talk I was trying to like outline, like, you know, there's a constant process of like appealing to the periphery, right? And so, and over time, you see, you know, parliamentary sovereignty, and like there's this appeals to the people. This develops into the idea of the individual, and then like we're already doing it. We're already talking about the sovereign individual. It's not we, it's the power, like it's the crypto power. It's this egregore that's all godlike thing above us that's doing it. And so like what's part of our political formula, like what I put in that one of the first 2 slides or whatever it is, like these ideas are like what is appealing to the periphery, which is why we're attracting capital in the first place, right? And so it's just a matter of developing those and propagating them and getting people to understand why they actually matter and what we mean when we say them. Yeah.
It's been a pleasure knowing and talking to you from the first time that we met, Jared, and it's an honor to share a stage with you and watch the development of your thinking. In my opinion, this man is one of the most important thought leaders in our movement and also for a wider public. Thank you so much, Jared.